When you look at this Thursday slate, college hoops fans know exactly what time it is. Neutral site battles, travel fatigue, early season adjustments, and teams trying to figure out who they really are. And that's why this TCU vs. Florida matchup on November 27, 2025, immediately jumps out. There's a lot going on beneath the surface, and this game brings together two programs taking very different early season paths. So let's break this one down in true beyond the box score fashion and find the strongest betting angle using only the numbers and trends already on the board. This showdown is being played in San Diego, which adds an important layer. It's a long flight for TCU, but for Florida, it's a cross-country haul, and that matters when you're talking about rhythm, conditioning, and how teams start games away from home. Anytime you get these neutral site setups, especially this early in the season, it creates spots where teams either show maturity or get exposed by travel and lack of chemistry. Florida enters the season with sky-high expectations, and that's natural after coming off a national championship run. At 4-1, the win-loss column looks solid, but the betting column tells a different story. Florida is 1-4 ATS, and that record alone explains plenty. Their only cover came against Miami, and even then, it was because that number was somewhat reasonable at just -10.5. The issues have come when they've been forced to cover gigantic spreads, -37.5 versus Mary, -43.5 versus North Florida, -17.5 versus Florida State. Those are huge numbers for any team, even elite ones, and Florida simply hasn't executed cleanly enough on offense to clear those tall margins. And that's the heart of Florida's problem right now. They're not hitting shots at the rate a team of this caliber should. They're shooting just 25.7% from three, which is well below where they expect to be and far below what's required when sportsbooks hang big spreads on you. Add in turnover issues, they're coughing it up on nearly 20% of their possessions, and that combination makes covering large favorites nearly impossible. They're still winning games comfortably, but winning and covering are two completely different conversations. What's encouraging for Florida backers, though, is that these are fixable issues. Shooting slumps correct themselves over time, especially for a team with this much talent and physical size. Free throw inconsistencies also tend to level out as players settle into the rhythm of the season. Florida isn't failing because the system is broken. They're simply underperforming on the offensive efficiency side, and that's the kind of thing that eventually normalizes. On the other side, TCU's season started in as brutal a way as any team could imagine, an outright loss to New Orleans as 21-point favorites. That's the kind of loss that can either derail a season or spark a response, and to their credit, TCU did bounce back with a strong effort against Michigan. And considering what Michigan has been doing this week in Vegas, absolutely dominating opponents, that close loss looks even more respectable in hindsight. TCU showed fight, showed speed, and showed they can compete when locked in. But this matchup presents some real challenges for the Horned Frogs. The size discrepancy is not small, it's enormous. TCU ranks 313th nationally in average height, while Florida ranks 21st. That's a massive gap. When a team that small meets a team with that much length and physicality, especially in the paint, it creates issues on the boards, in shot contests, and in defending around the rim. TCU can get bullied inside, and Florida's roster is built to take advantage of smaller lineups. And this is also where the predictive element comes in. Florida is simply not going to shoot 25% from three for the entire season. They're not going to keep turning the ball over at this rate all year. Regression exists for a reason. Bad stretches don't last forever for talented teams. When those numbers begin correcting, their ability to cover more manageable spreads increases dramatically. And this number, while still double digits, is a far cry from the 20 to 40 point spreads they've been failing to cover. TCU's competitiveness against Michigan shows they can hang with strong teams when they're playing clean basketball, but they've also shown volatility. Again, they lost outright to New Orleans. That inconsistency raises questions about how they'll handle a Florida team with elite length and a strong defensive identity. When you combine Florida's size advantage, expected shooting correction, the neutral site environment, and TCU's early season instability, the matchup leans toward Florida having a real opportunity to not only win but win in a way that finally aligns with their expectations. It's not the biggest edge on the board, especially on a slate loaded with NFL action, but if you're choosing a side in this game, Florida laying the points makes the most sense. So the play here is Florida minus the number. Not a must-bet game, not one to sprint to the window for, but if you're adding it to your card, Florida has the stronger profile, the higher upside, and the statistical indicators pointing toward improvement. Next one is being played out in Palm Springs, California, a massive travel advantage for Stanford, and a long, inconvenient haul for Minnesota. Neutral courts always add a layer of unpredictability, but geographic familiarity absolutely matters, especially with college teams still settling into their identity this early in the year. Let's start with Stanford, because they're coming off a frustrating loss in their previous outing. They were laying 10.5 points at home against Seattle and ended up losing that game outright by 8. That was their first loss of the season, and even though the final score looks bad, there's context worth considering. They simply couldn't get into rhythm offensively. They finished with just 69 points, and it was one of those flat nights where nothing opens up, no matter how many times you run the offense. But one off night doesn't erase what they've already shown. In their earlier wins, they posted 89 against Portland State, 91 against Montana, and 93 against Louisiana Lafayette. Those games displayed exactly what this team is capable of when they're clicking. Stanford has firepower, they have spacing, and they have shooters who can score in bunches. One bad outing doesn't define them, especially when that loss creates a buy low opportunity. Minnesota enters at 4-2 straight up, but 2-4 against the spread, and their recent form raises legitimate concerns. They just lost at home to San Francisco, a game where they were actually a 1-point favorite but ended up losing by 12. That's not the kind of performance you want to see from a team trying to find consistency. And the games before that don't inspire much confidence either. Against Chicago State, one of the weakest teams in Division I, they were favored by 27.5 but only won by 12, scoring just 66 points in the process. And before that, Minnesota was a 25.5-point favorite against Green Bay, another struggling team, and only one that won by 7. When you're laying huge numbers against very weak teams and barely escaping, it tells you something about offensive ceiling and overall cohesion. This is where the numbers start to separate these two programs. Stanford shoots the three better. Stanford shoots free throws better. Stanford turns the ball over less. And, according to KenPom, Stanford grades out as the better defensive team at this point in the season. That's notable because Minnesota's program identity over the past few years has been built on defense. That was their anchor, their calling card. But right now, Stanford is the more efficient team on that side of the ball as well. When the expected strength of one team is being outperformed by the opponent, the matchup becomes even tougher to navigate. Offensively, Minnesota has been laboring to create clean looks. The low-scoring performances against inferior opponents highlight issues with spacing, shot creation, and ball security. Meanwhile, Stanford has multiple games this season where they pushed into the high 80s and low 90s with balance, tempo, and quality perimeter shooting. And although their loss to Seattle was disappointing, it sets up exactly the type of situation sharp bettors look for. A good team coming off a bad game, undervalued heading into a bounce-back spot. And the location matters. Playing in Palm Springs heavily favors Stanford from a travel and comfort perspective. Minnesota is not only far from home but also stepping into an environment where the pace, time zone, and surroundings are all foreign. Neutral site games can get sloppy, but sloppiness usually hurts the less polished offensive team, and right now, that's Minnesota. Both teams are coming off losses, but the underlying performances weren't the same. Minnesota's losses exposed issues that have been present for multiple games now. Stanford's loss looked more like a one-game offensive stumble rather than a deeper structural problem. When you combine Stanford's stronger shooting numbers, better defensive metrics, lower turnover rate, and higher offensive ceiling, the edge leans clearly in their direction. For that reason, the play here is Stanford. The line doesn't reflect what these teams have shown so far, and the market is offering a buy low opportunity after Stanford's loss to Seattle. This matchup fits the profile of a team that should respond with more intensity and cleaner execution, especially with Minnesota failing to deliver against weaker competition. I expect Stanford to show up with urgency, get back to their identity, and handle business in this spot. College basketball fans, buckle up, because this one has the makings of a classic early season test. BYU and Miami square off on Thursday, November 27, 2025, and anytime you get two programs with drastically different levels of early season battle testing, you get a matchup where edges start to reveal themselves quickly. Neutral site games are always fascinating, and this one is being played down in CMI, Florida, which effectively turns a neutral court into something much closer to Miami's backyard. BYU has to travel all the way from Utah for this, while Miami is essentially taking a 4-hour drive. Travel matters, rhythm matters, and location advantages matter, but none of it overrides who the better, more proven team actually is. And that's where BYU's resume jumps off the page. They haven't just played quality opponents. They've already taken on some of the toughest teams of the early season and delivered real results. They opened the year by beating Villanova. Then they went toe-to-toe with UConn in a neutral site environment at TD Garden, losing that game by only 2. And then in their most recent outing, they completely handled Wisconsin and won by 18. Those aren't just wins. They're battle-testing moments that define a team's maturity, its poise, and its ability to respond when things tighten up late in games. BYU has already had to fight through difficult possessions, physical matchups, and high-pressure environments, and they've shown they can navigate it. Miami, on the other hand, is sitting on a very different kind of resume. Their only true test was against Florida, and they lost that matchup by 14. Every other opponent they've seen, Jacksonville, Bethune-Cookman, Stetson, Elon, Delaware State, has been a clearly inferior program. Those are games where you don't get pushed physically, mentally, or schematically. You don't get sped up. You don't see what type of team you really are. So while Miami has wins on paper, none of them have revealed much about their ceiling or their identity. The one time they played a team capable of matching them talent for talent, they were beaten and they didn't cover. Now, from a matchup standpoint, Miami has some things working in their direction. They have size, which you need if you're going to stay competitive with BYU. They have the ability to match them physically, at least for stretches. And I'll be honest, I genuinely tried to make a case for Miami in this spot because on the surface, the travel advantage plus the roster makeup should make this tempting. But when you watch how BYU plays across 2 full halves, you see a team that can create runs, build momentum, and control tempo in ways Miami simply hasn't proven they can stop. BYU plays composed basketball, and they've already shown that in multiple high-level games. What I keep coming back to is this: BYU has been tested. Miami has not. And when a team that hasn't faced real pressure suddenly has to play against an opponent that has been sharpening its edges against legitimate competition, those flaws get exposed quickly. BYU knows how to handle pace, how to defend without fouling in big moments, how to put together multiple scoring stretches when a game gets tight, and how to dig in defensively when needed. Miami hasn't had to do any of that yet, and based on the Florida game, their one attempt at it didn't go well. And that's really where my pick settles. I genuinely tried, to talk myself into Miami because on paper, the location advantage is real, and their size does give them a fighting chance. I was right on the edge of giving Miami out as the play. But every time I imagined how this game plays out over 40 minutes, I kept seeing the same scenario in my head. Me taking Miami, looking up at the scoreboard late in the second half, and seeing them down 15 with 3 minutes left, knowing I ignored the better, more complete team. That inner hesitation is usually a sign, and the more I revisited it, the clearer it got. BYU is simply stronger, more polished, more battle-ready, and more capable of going on scoring runs that Miami hasn't shown the ability to match. So I'm sticking with my gut here. Even though I flirted with the idea of taking Miami, I can't ignore everything BYU has shown so far. They're the better team, they're more trustworthy, and they're the side I'm comfortable laying points with. The Cougars have already been through real tests this season, and I think that experience shows up again in this matchup. The pick is BYU. Now, let's talk about the actual on-court situation, because these two teams have been on the wrong end of this Las Vegas tournament from the start. Neither group came in with strong momentum, and their results this week have reflected that. UNLV opened their run by pulling Maryland in the first round, and despite hanging around for stretches, they dropped that one by 7 points. After that, they got matched up with Alabama, and that turned into a full-on disaster. Alabama ran them out of the gym, 115-76, and that score wasn't misleading, they were completely overwhelmed on both ends. It exposed how quickly UNLV can fall apart when they're forced into an up-tempo pace or when they get punched early by a more athletic team. Rutgers didn't get it any easier. Their first opponent was Tennessee, and that one got sideways fast, turning into a 25-point loss. But unlike UNLV, Rutgers at least responded in the next game with a competitive effort. They drew Notre Dame, hung around, kept the game within reach the entire way, and ended up losing by only 5, enough to grab a cover and show that their style can still grind games down when the matchups are favorable. Both of these teams essentially limped their way through this event, and in a lot of ways, they came in looking like the lower-tier teams in the field. That's what makes this handicap tricky. Neither team has shown consistency, and both have glaring issues that make them hard to trust. But when you start breaking the matchup down piece by piece, Rutgers does carve out a small edge, even if it's one you need to handle with caution. First, Rutgers is shooting the ball from deep at a better rate. They aren't elite by any means, but hitting threes at 35.3% gives them at least one reliable offensive tool, especially when everything else isn't working. The big problem is their two-point scoring, which has been truly rough this season. They're sitting at just 46% inside the arc, which is a major issue for a team that actually has solid size. They're struggling at the rim, missing shots they should convert, and that limits their ability to build momentum in the half-court. Still, because UNLV isn't exactly dominant defensively inside, Rutgers may get a little breathing room there compared to their last two opponents. And that size advantage does matter here. Rutgers comes in a bit bigger, and in a game that's likely to be slower and more possession-based than what we saw earlier in the tournament, that edge can play a role in rebounding, controlling pace, and forcing UNLV into tougher looks. Neither team jumps off the page statistically, but stylistically, Rutgers tends to perform better when the matchup is close, physical, and grindy, exactly the type of game this has the potential to become. Handicapping this contest, though, still isn't comfortable. Both teams are coming in off ugly losses. Both have struggled to string together good minutes. And both are capable of letting a winnable game slip away because of lapses on either end of the floor. But when you factor in Rutgers catching points here, that's where the play starts to make a little more sense. If this turns into the tight, competitive matchup it's projected to be, getting those extra points becomes valuable, and Rutgers' slight statistical and physical advantages help tilt the lean. This isn't the strongest game on the board, and it's definitely not one you want to force action on if you're building a tight card. But based strictly on matchup, performance through the tournament, and how the numbers line up, the side I'm taking here is Rutgers plus the points. It's the spot that carries the most logical value in what should be a close, unpredictable matchup between two teams that haven't exactly impressed so far this week. If you enjoyed this breakdown and you want more daily college basketball analysis delivered with real betting strategy behind it, make sure you're locked in here at Beyond the Box Score. Drop a like, tell me your pick for this game in the comments, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our upcoming prediction videos. This channel is built for serious fans and bettors who want smarter insights every single day. I'll see you in the next one.